In 1886, Howard Goldsmid, a 19-year-old journalist from Birmingham, disguised himself as a tramp and headed to London to see firsthand what life was like in the low-life haunts of the metropolis. In the October of that year, the book of his experiences, titled Dottings of A Dosser, being revelations of the inner life of low London lodging houses, was published. In it, Goldsmid took his readers on a tour of the common lodging houses of London and confronted them with the everyday lives of those who have neither house nor room that they can call their own, and who night after night, week in, week out, for many a weary year, doss in the nearest lodging house and hardly dare to dream of any other or better accommodation. While they live, he continued, their principal care is to find the necessary fourpence each night, together with a few coppers more for food, or at all events, for drink. The book provides a vivid, not to say flesh-creeping and stomach-churning glimpse of everyday life in the common lodging houses in the thoroughfares off Commercial Street that 2 years later would play an important part in the story of the Whitechapel murders, since almost all of the victims were residing at them at the times of their deaths. 2 of the so-called canonical 5 victims, Mary Nichols and Annie Chapman, were ejected from a lodging house in the early hours of the mornings of their deaths because they didn't have the necessary fourpence to pay for their beds, and were therefore effectively driven into the clutches of Jack the Ripper. But where did someone go when they didn't have the money to pay for their bed? And what was it like to find yourself wandering the streets of Spitalfields, desperate for a safe place in which to shelter? Goldsmid devoted an entire chapter to the plight of these homeless dossers, and reading it, it is worth remembering that the situations he describes are exactly those that both Mary Nichols and Annie Chapman would encounter less than 2 years later. No sketch of doss house life, or would it be more correct to say existence, however slight, would be in any sense complete if it failed to include some brief mention of the condition and sufferings of those who, not having the few necessary halfpence, are unable to obtain a shelter of any sort. Their position is deplorable, and the more so because it is to a large extent not susceptible of alteration. Filth and stench may be removed by state intervention and private enterprise, but poverty is not so readily to be displaced. Human beings can be prevented by legislative interference from herding together like swine, but no Act of Parliament will put money into a man's pocket or give him a night's lodging gratis. When you enter the kitchen of a doss house, it would be a mistake to suppose that all these people you meet are going to spend the night under its roof. Many of them are regular uns who, in consideration of their constant patronage, are permitted to spend the evening or a portion of it before the blazing coke fire, for though the deputy will give no trust, he knows better than to offend a regular lodger. As the evening wears on, however, these poor wretches become restless and moody. They pace the floor with their hands in their otherwise empty pockets, glancing towards the door at each fresh arrival to see if a pal has come in from whom it may be possible to borrow the halfpence necessary to complete their doss-house money. At last, their final hope being gone, they shuffle out into the street and prepare to spend the night with only the sky for a canopy. The parks, of course, are the most favoured resort of the penniless dosser. The gentlemen in blue are often reproached and upbraided, but there is more real kindness of heart and good nature under the policeman's jacket than most people imagine. To the dossers, who are obliged to sleep out, they are as forbearing as their duty will permit, and many a little kindness have I seen Robert do to some poor starveling wretch who probably would never dream of acknowledging or requiting it in any way, and would heartily curse the whole force 5 minutes afterwards. One exception, however, must be made. It is said that the policeman on duty at Trafalgar Square has recently adopted the practice of sousing the seats there with water to keep them casuals off. Of course, this is done in obedience to orders, but it seems nevertheless a piece of wanton cruelty to which there is good reason to object, and the same condemnation will apply to the policy of eviction recently decided upon with regard to those who make the seats along the Thames Embankment their resting place. Thrall Street, Flower and Dean Street, Dorset Street, Parker Street, and similar thoroughfares are night after night thronged with dossers who have no money for a night's shelter. They lie on the curbstone, in the gutters, on heaps of rubbish, anywhere, or walk up and down with their hands in their pockets and their dull, sleepy eyes almost closed. Some of them, of course, are wastrels on whom it would be idle to lavish any pity. But a considerable number are men and women who are, or have been, honest, labouring folk whom the depression of trade, which has for so many years blighted the happiness of the industrial population, has ruined. Some of the men have been walking about seeking for work since 6 o'clock in the morning, or even earlier. They have hung about the docks or the markets the whole day, and very possibly have not earned even a penny. The women and children are even more to be pitied, the latter especially so. I am acquainted with the case of a woman who tries to earn a living by hawking clothes pegs, sometimes in London and sometimes in the country. She tramps about with 3 little children, and during the whole of the winter of 1885 to 1886, not one of them slept under a roof. Nor is this an exceptional or isolated instance. Many a stunted, sickly child, who, after lingering out a wretched, unwholesome existence, a burden to itself and its protectors, goes into a decline and succumbs at last to disease, can trace the inception of its malady to the nights it has spent crouched in a doorway or huddled in a heap upon the pavement. The churches and churchyards too, or such of them as afford any accommodation, have always their share of hungry, ragged men and women hanging on the railings or crouching down by the walls. Christchurch, Spitalfields and St. George's Church Borough are examples. Every night there are dozens of homeless creatures, male and female, half leaning, half lying on the low rail-topped wall that surrounds each building. Outside Christchurch in particular, the scene is most painful, for the women there are all of the Flower and Dean Street type, that is to say, of the lowest type conceivable. One exception, indeed, I have seen, a woman of middle age, crouching against the wall, half crying. She said she had been out for the last 3 nights, and as far as she could see, would be out for many more. She had eaten nothing all that day, for she was a needlewoman and work was slack, and, she added, as a couple of wretched girls came flaunting by, singing an obscene chorus, "I'd sooner starve twice over than get my living like them." London Bridge, too, is a favourite haunt of the Dosser. The broad stone benches in the recesses on either side are always fully occupied, some of the folk sitting, some reclining at full length. There are a couple of coffee stalls at the borough end of the bridge, and these do good business, for there is nothing so comforting as a cup of coffee on a cool night when one misses the bedclothes. I have a kindness for the coffee stall keepers. Taking them as a rule, they are decent, well-behaved, civil people, and are not devoid of pity for the unfortunate. Many a time will they cut the halfpenny slice of bread and butter larger and spread it more thickly, because they see the wistful look of chronic hunger in the longing eyes of some unkempt, haggard customer. But there are sadder sights to be seen among these homeless ones than men resting on a bridge or against a wall. Often have I met a man and his wife, each with a sleeping child in their arms, walking aimlessly about the streets as they have walked through all the weary hours of the long silent night. Gaunt, weak, hollow-eyed, they seldom speak to one another, but walk on in the same mechanical manner. Kip-houses are bad with their close, foul rooms and vermin-covered beds, but to these poor wretches anything would be better than tramping the hard flags, whose resonant echoes mock their heavy footfalls. Yet it is no uncommon sight this, and the only certain thing, in addition to the misery and want that are so obvious, appears to be that it is to a large extent irremediable. But bad as all this is in spring and summer, it is 10,000 times worse when the autumn rains and the winter fogs supervene, when the sleet and snow pour piteously down, sowing the seeds of consumption and death alike in strong men and feeble women and children. There could be no greater charity than the invention of some means, if any can be devised, to relieve the suffering and alleviate the wants of those who are compelled to tramp the streets of the livelong night because they have no doss money.